are listening to the Alzheimer's Podcast with Mike Good of Togetherness, your number one resource for practical tips and insights, empowering you and your family to live well with Alzheimer's. Hello and welcome to episode 7 of the Alzheimer's Podcast. I'm Mike Good of Togetherness. Thank you for joining me today to listen to this podcast where my goal is always to empower you to maintain a positive experience, reduce and eliminate the need for medications, and make your time together with those you care for the best it can be. In the first 6 episodes, I've discussed ways to make living with Alzheimer's disease or another dementia in your life a more positive experience. I launched the podcast this way because I really wanted to dispel all the negativity that surrounds the disease. Of course, there are a lot of negative aspects that come with the disease, but hopefully, if you've listened to any of the prior episodes, you can see how you can also find and foster joy. In this episode, however, I'm going to take a step back and cover some of the basics about Alzheimer's disease and dementia. It's important that you have a good foundation of knowledge. Knowledge is power and gives us strength and insights to proceed. When we don't understand something, we tend to fear it. We then tend to avoid the situation. Rather than being proactive, we become reactive, which gives us a feeling of being out of control. Now, the best way to take back control and reduce guilt often associated with caregiving is through knowledge and action. As the care partner for someone with dementia, you must also be an advocate for the disease. This means you need to help educate other people when you can. The vast majority of people know very little about dementia, and what they think they know is generally wrong. In this episode, I'm going to discuss the history of Alzheimer's disease, the prevalence of the disease, the relationship of Alzheimer's and dementia, what Alzheimer's is and how it affects the brain, and I'll conclude today's episode by touching on the progression of the disease, which is typically referred to as the stages of Alzheimer's. This material is derived from my free Introduction to Alzheimer's course that I will link to in the show notes at togetherness.com/episode 7. This course, much like the last episode on creating a care plan for improved care, includes worksheets and other resources to help you get the foundation of knowledge you need and deserve. Let's get started by taking a quick look at the significant milestones related to Alzheimer's disease. If you're listening to this sometime in the distant future, please understand that this recording was done in 2017. Now, just over 100 years ago in 1906, Dr. Alzheimer had a patient who exhibited memory loss, language difficulty, and unusual, whatever that means, behavior. The autopsy revealed abnormal clumps and tangles in her brain, and today these clumps and tangles are still considered indicators of Alzheimer's disease. In 1910, Alzheimer's disease was named. It was 58 years later before there was another significant milestone when in 1968 a cognitive measurement scale was developed. Now, such a scale is used to determine how advanced the disease is and tries to quantify an individual's loss of abilities. I personally wondered why there was a 58-year gap, and what seems to make sense to me is the fact that in 1906, the average life expectancy was only 50 years of age, but this increased to 70 years by 1968. And as I will touch on in an upcoming episode, the number one risk factor for Alzheimer's disease is age. So as life expectancies increased, more cases were identified, resulting in more awareness. In 1976, Alzheimer's was recognized as the most common form of dementia. In 1979 and 1980, just 36 and 37 years ago, the Alzheimer's Society of the UK and the Alzheimer's Association in the United States were formed. It wasn't until 1984 that the National Institute on Aging started funding Alzheimer's disease research. In 1987, we had our first drug trial, and in 1993, the first drug to treat Alzheimer's was approved by the FDA. That drug has since been discontinued, but others, as I discussed in episode 3 on medications, have replaced it. And most recently, in 2015, the U.S. federal government increased research funding to $936 million. Now that sounds like a lot of money, but by comparison, cancer funding is 6 times more at over $6 billion, and HIV funding is more than $3 billion. So we still have a long ways to go to get the research funding needed. As you can see, an awareness of Alzheimer's disease has existed for a little more than 100 years, but it's still not that long since efforts have been put forward to better understand and treat it. Oh, and by the way, in 2014, Together in This was founded by myself. Now that we're done with the history, going forward, please understand that while I will primarily use the word Alzheimer's, many of the techniques and information you will learn are also applicable to other types of dementia. You're not alone. It's estimated that 47 million people worldwide have some form of dementia, and as mentioned, the most prevalent of which is Alzheimer's disease. For the most part, for every person with dementia, there's a family also affected. So you can double, triple, and probably quadruple that 47 million to really understand how many people are affected by the disease throughout the world. Now, worldwide, there's a new case every 3.2 seconds. That's 27,000 new cases per day, or over 9.6 million annually. Just take a moment and think about that. From the time you pushed play on this recording until now, there have been nearly 100 new cases. So you can see that while you may feel like you are alone in this situation, you are not alone. Not only are there millions of families just like yours who are affected by dementia, there are also tens of thousands of professionals that are willing to help if you just ask. I'd like to mention that I try to look at and convey my message that Alzheimer's is a worldwide problem. We tend to focus on our own countries, but we are together in this, and we need to work together. And unfortunately, in my opinion, we are following the same process that occurred with cancer and HIV, where research was siloed in different countries, and within those countries where research was siloed even further. This has invariably slowed the race for a cure because we're not sharing and working together. So let's clear up the relationship of Alzheimer's and dementia. Dementia describes a group of symptoms affecting mental abilities which interfere with daily functioning. It's an umbrella term which covers anywhere from 50 to 100 types of dementia depending on which study or report you read. Sometimes the symptoms of dementia are caused by things such as vitamin deficiencies, depression, or alcohol abuse, and as a result can be corrected. This is why it's very important to get a proper and early diagnosis. Our learning focus is on the types of dementia that can't be cured, such as Alzheimer's, which is the most common type of dementia, frontotemporal, Lewy body, Parkinson's, or vascular dementia, just to name a few others. Sometimes it's easier to think of dementia as a fruit, and Alzheimer's is the most common type of fruit, say an apple. So exactly what is Alzheimer's disease? Alzheimer's is a terminal illness for which there is no cure, no miracle drug, and it's the most prevalent form of dementia, as I've mentioned. It's the 6th leading cause of death in the United States, and in areas with a higher percentage of older adults, it's even higher. For instance, in my county of San Diego, it's recognized as the 3rd leading cause of death. And there's a common belief in the Alzheimer's community that these stats are understated because of the way the cause of death may be listed on the death certificate. Often Alzheimer's is listed as the secondary cause, even though it's what eventually led to death. Now, I will not go into the probable causes because the studies are simply all over the place, and my focus is to educate you on how to cope with the impact of the disease. However, I will touch on causes and risk factors in an upcoming episode. Let's discuss what happens in the brain. It's believed that abnormal deposits of protein form amyloid plaques and tau tangles throughout the brain. These are those same clumps and tangles Dr. Alzheimer's discovered. When this happens, healthy neurons stop functioning, lose connection with other neurons, and die, so those pathways no longer exist. This results in physical damage to the brain from the deterioration, and as a result, Alzheimer's disease is classified as an irreversible degenerative disease. Remember, the brain's very complex, and we likely know very little about how it truly works. For instance, I have read there are cases where a person's brain looked like the brain of a person with severe Alzheimer's, but they never showed symptoms of dementia. Now let's talk a little bit about the progression of the disease. For Alzheimer's disease, it's believed progression of the disease generally starts in the hippocampus area of the brain. The hippocampus is responsible for creating memories, and this is why short-term memory loss is generally the first symptom people notice. In my course, I have an image where you can see how the disease progresses as different areas of the brain become damaged over time. The progression may last anywhere from 2 to 20 plus years, and it may start earlier than anyone realizes. I have online friends with dementia who are still living active, albeit more challenging lives, 10 or more years after diagnosis. And in an upcoming episode, I'll discuss more about this as well. Of course, different parts of the brain are responsible for different abilities. I should mention that for other forms of dementia, the progression is different and will affect different areas of the brain. For instance, frontotemporal dementia affects the brain's frontal lobes. That's the area just behind the forehead. Or it's temporal lobes, the regions behind your ears. As the different parts of the brain are affected, the individual may begin to experience other symptoms such as additional memory issues, language and speech difficulties, impaired judgment or reasoning, decline in critical thinking abilities, problems with visual and spatial perceptions, and various issues with any of the senses such as hearing or smell. Some people even hallucinate smells with some forms of dementia. I have an online friend who often smells burning when there's nothing burning. How scary is that? Remember, the brain controls everything, so eventually the area that controls motor skills would degrade and impact a person's mobility and their ability to perform everyday tasks that you and I might take for granted, such as dressing and bathing. Since there is a typical progression of the disease, there are stages that have been identified to help people have a better understanding of their loved one's situation. So the last thing I want to talk about today are these stages. It may sound cliche, but when you've met one person, and I like to say one family with Alzheimer's, you've met one family with Alzheimer's. Every family situation is different, and how they cope with the stages and how it impacts them is different. An individual's needs and abilities vary, and everyone experiences a different rate of decline and loss of abilities. For instance, I know a gentleman who's been living with Alzheimer's for over 20 years. If you were unfamiliar with Alzheimer's and you happened to casually meet him, it's likely you wouldn't figure it out, not at least until you tried to engage in conversation. He's still very mobile, happy, and conversational. The stages which we'll look at in a moment overlap, and people may move from stage to stage even within the same day or hour. And as I've discussed in prior episodes, you really want to be careful to not focus too much on the stage they are in, but on how you can best accommodate their needs and keep them feeling purposeful while maintaining their dignity by focusing on their remaining abilities. Now, there are different models, including 3, 4, and 7 stage views. Rather than go into those details, you'll be able to find additional information in the show notes. With the 3-stage view, it's basically early, middle, and late. Not much detail, but it conveys the point. Understand that during the early and middle stages, and quite possibly even into the late stages, the individual may very well be aware of their situation. We need to be sensitive to the emotional aspect this creates as they find themselves facing more daily challenges. The early stage is marked by short-term memory loss. Communication, both speaking and listening, may become more challenging, and they may struggle to complete complex routines. They're able to still care for themselves and require minimal assistance. Now, during the middle stage, there's a continued decline and the reliance on others increases. And during the late stages, they lose the ability to clearly verbalize, and they eventually require full-time care. The 7-stage view obviously goes into more detail. Rather than go into those details, you can check out my resource page on the progression and stages of Alzheimer's disease. Instead of strictly focusing on loss, I want you to do what Susan Macaulay recommends and take a glass half full view of the stages and reframe your view of the disease. Now, I've covered a lot in this episode, and I realize you may be feeling overwhelmed and scared, but I assure you those are normal emotions to have, and continuing to educate yourself is the best way to cope with these emotions. Remember, you are not alone. In today's episode, I covered the history of Alzheimer's, which showed you some key milestones related to the disease. You also discovered how relatively brief the history has been. You learned there are many types of dementia, and Alzheimer's is the most common. And you're not alone. Over 47 million families worldwide are coping with some form of dementia. And during this episode, there have been nearly 300 new cases. Alzheimer's results from physical damage to the brain, and there is no cure. Progression can last for decades, or it can be much quicker. Alzheimer's and other types of dementia affect much more than just memory. And while the timeline may vary, the progression is typically the same and has been broken down into stages to help you understand your loved one's current condition. Now, if you haven't already, I recommend you download my free introductory guide to Alzheimer's and start by implementing the 3 initial steps that are outlined on page 3 of the guide, and continue to use the guide to help you better understand other aspects I haven't covered yet. Also, register for my free Introduction to Alzheimer's course, which includes additional resources such as videos, articles, and worksheets. That concludes this episode. Thank you for joining me today. And I'm super excited about episode 8, where Mary Sue Wilkinson of Singing Heart to Heart will join me to discuss how you can use music to enrich the life of your loved one and to improve the care you provide. Bye now, and be sure to head over to the show notes at togetherinthis.com/episode 7 to continue empowering yourself with knowledge. You've been listening to the Alzheimer's Podcast with Mike Good of Togetherness. For more information and to get the resources mentioned in this episode, visit togetherinthis.com/podcast.